Peace and blessing to all. Welcome. And what an opportunity to sit at the feet of such sagacious elders who are so generous with their lived experience, right? So we were in pre-production just now, and I was like, y'all, look at my face. Look at how my face is beaming. This is not lotion. Like, this is not hair product that has slid down my face. Like, this is the energy that I've been infused with, sitting and so humbled by this entire experience. And that last, whew, just still kind of verklempt in a beautiful way. Um, so I have no doubt that our next experience will be even more bright as we approach something that's somewhat what our culture considers dark. So today we have AmarAtma Singh Khalsa to talk about compassionate grieving and healing the invisible wounds of loss. And before I dive into introduction of him and his amazing work, I also want to share that I'm a lover of grief too. Yes, you heard that correctly. I'm a lover of grief. Yes, I have been forced into loving grief. But grief has been the teacher to teach me about impermanence, about the power of love, and the connection to the unseen. Rashid talked yesterday about us not having, it's terrible to think we need to get through this by ourselves. Grief reminds us of the connection that we share to one another and to what is before us and behind us. Grief connects us to impermanence, but also eternity. But before I get way too down that road, I'm going to introduce Allison Strickland, who has been our artist in residence, to give an update about the work that she's doing. And then I will give AmarAtma his true introduction and we will vibe from there. So, Allison?
Thank you so much, Reggie. It has been truly so nourishing to be here with you all this week. I wanted to share some contemplations in how I'm thinking about my work as I'm in the creation process. I did complete the foundation of the painting today, but just to give you an idea of the meditation that is really starting to anchor. As I think of healing, I think of snake, an enigmatic symbol. Just as the concept of healing can be enigmatic, the snake represents many things. It's been used as a symbol for deceit and temptation, and also as a symbol of rebirth, awakening, and transformation. The snake around a staff, a symbol for Western medicine, two snakes around a staff, a symbol for Hermes, alchemical, turning lead into gold. The snake eating its own tail, the Ouroboros, pointing at the cyclical nature of all things, where the end is the beginning and the beginning is the end. The snake sheds its skin to remind us that though we are always healing, we are also always whole. Healing can also feel dual in nature. Sometimes it feels overwhelming or laborious, and sometimes it feels like an outburst of laughter or just the sun on your skin. May our healing be easeful, absent of fixing, unburdened, simply giving each moment the best we can, open to what is, honest, knowing that loving ourselves and each other is enough, because though we may feel like there is much to heal, we are also always whole. As I've been sitting on the sessions through the week, I've been noticing a really interesting pattern emerge. And many of our facilitators have been saying these really potent S words that have started to feel like snake medicine to me, this healing medicine. So I just want to kind of repeat them and reintroduce some of what I've heard in the space. Um, Sensitivity is divinity, safety, simplicity, surrender, see no stranger, solidarity, sensuality, shielded by the infinite, sage sees through the eyes of love, strategy, spark, systems, space, sorrow, sacred, spirit. So maybe we can take just a moment to receive a breath together and let that land. Thank you, Reggie. Thank you, AmarAtma, for letting me pop in here. If any of you um, want to hear more about the work, I will be sharing the completed painting on Friday, but you can get a sneak peek now. It's on Kripalu's Instagram stories to see the foundation. And if it speaks to you, I will also be offering 50 limited edition prints that will be hand embellished. Hand embellished means that I will be spending time in meditation and painting original gold dashes on each and every one of them. And I believe Miles can share that link. So thank you so much. I look forward to sharing more with you Friday when the piece is complete. Thank you.
Allison, thank you so much for your wisdom and in keeping with the serendipity of this conference. I mean, yesterday I talked about ancient technologies, and that's what Michelle talked about the entire time. Like that was a riff. Like that wasn't like, Reggie, I want you to mention this. Like that just totally happened. And you talking about snakes. Like look at my ring. So yes, the year. Oh, stop it! Stop! Right. So let this snake energy in this year of the wood snake allow us to shed what no longer serves. So thank you for your update, and you can crash this party anytime, right? Like if there's no art, there's no healing, right? So we're talking about how we heal. We got to have art. For those of you who are newer to the space, if you haven't already, please say the lands that you're in. Like I'm still dialing in from the Unceded territory of the Piscataway Nation. So just to honor our forebearers all the time, right? So not just at the top or at the bottom, but to presence ourselves with the continuation of life that happens beyond like the myth of the American story. So honoring the lands where we're on. Um, it is now, family, my honor to introduce AmarAtma Singh Khalsa, a grief coach, an end of life care advocate, and a speaker who supports people navigating profound loss. With a background in chaplaincy and integrative wellness, his approach combines spirituality, psychology, and compassionate presence. And in this conversation on compassionate grieving, healing the invisible wounds of loss, I'm excited to welcome this conversation and grateful for the shift that he wanted to make it a conversation because y'all, like, grief is something that tapped me on the shoulder a couple years ago and was just like, I want to sit with you and you need to teach me. And I was like, grief, what are you talking about? Y'all, I lost the equivalent of my brother to a pulmonary embolism on October 19th, 2021. And you just don't think death will happen to you or loss will happen to you, but it's one of the rules of the realm. Larry talked about that in the last lecture. Like impermanence, loss is part of this thing called life. And when I turned towards grief, what I thought was unbearable became manageable because my grief, I opened up to the world and began teaching grief from my deep pain, and it has now impacted thousands of people. And simply, if only by me being a man of color talking about grief from an open heart and crying, right? So smashing these paradigms of I'm tough, I'll be fine. Nah, like I'm not okay because I just lost my brother, and why should I be okay? I remember when grieving Corey, people would be like, "Are you over that yet?" I was like, no, because he's still dead. Like, I'm over you being shitty towards me. That's what I'm over. Like, I'm not over him because he just died. So how dare you say that? So it is an honor to welcome this profound conversation with the space and the reverence that it deserves. Like, grief is not something that should be added on the back end. It is something that should be front and center. I'm even wearing my mourning shawl, MOURNING shawl, because that is the reverence with which I hold grief whenever I talk about it. I wear the robes of honor that grief deserves. So, AmarAtma Singh Khalsa, please welcome to the stage. Thank you for being here, for being in partnership, and please kick us off.
Reggie, I am absolutely floored by your voice, and your methodology and your brilliance and your invitation and your invocation in the space. I feel like I want an introduction on grief work to be like that every single time because the experience of it being this sort of polished, this sort of like, oh, let's talk about grief, let's talk about these myths, let's talk about these invisible losses. There's a raw and realness to it that is of spirit that we want to bring to spirit. And I love your introduction to this. I love your invocation for this. And for everybody who's listening and participating along, I think that we just had a massive download from the great spirit of Reggie that comes through for us and the vibe that he is carrying us through this whole week. And just thank you, Reggie, for being a presence, like a mala, right? You have beads that exist, but a string that kind of continues us all the way through. And the beads might be different colors, the different stones, the different shapes, different sizes. But Reggie, you're holding a very powerful thread as a consistency through all of this piece here. So as you've been through all these stories and this reverence and the sacredness of what we're trying to do with Amplify and the global community, and to really bring back kind of a lost teachings, like this isn't anything new. This is something we're trying to reclaim and something to bring back and
Totally.
almost a remembrance practice for us. Thank you for this invocation and this introduction. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for being here. And let's just have a couple of questions, right? So we'll hold space at the end for all questions, but we're gonna have a brief chat here, and then open it up because I found as a teacher, but also as a grief traveler, it's better to talk about it in community. Everyone thinks, "Oh, I'm the only one feeling this way." You're not, but we haven't normalized these conversations, so here's to normalizing them. So you describe grief as more than just the loss of a loved one. Can you share what you mean by invisible wounds? Because it's a cute word, but let's put some skin on that skeleton, and why these often go unrecognized in our culture.
Yeah, I know. I appreciate this. We're gonna do this nice Q&A kind of process together, and I like it that we're doing it as a dialogue. Before I jump into that, I want to
Yeah.
just jump in with a little bit of preamble around this work. I like your invocation around grief as an experience in this way, because to me, grief is one of my great teachers. And I was also forced into a grieving process as well that I wasn't quite excited for. And I think most people, when I worked in the hospital as a chaplain, right, this is the things everyone says. We didn't think that this would ever happen to us. And so the experience of grief, it can often be surprising. It can often be overwhelming when it comes. It could be a tidal wave of an experience. And we want to honor that the way that I see grief is similar to how Reggie offered this experience. I think of grief as like a rishi, like a maharishi, right? Like a great teacher. And it took me a long time to understand that because a lot of my work was trying to manage grief. I don't like the word manage. People are trying to solve grief. I don't like the word solve in this scenario. We try to fix grief. I don't like that word either because you don't fix something that's very normal and natural, right? We want to honor it. We want to recognize it. So I had to change my language about how I started talking about grief. And I had to use spiritual principles, spiritual language, sacred, reverent, devotional based language to recognize grief. Because for me, I was like, how is it that we have this thing? Like it baffles me. Like, let's just start with this. It baffles me that we are biologically wired to be in connection, to be in community, to be in relationship to each other, not to be alone and not to be by ourselves. And yet, grief and loss is a universal experience. The paradox of that messes with the mind.
Hmm.
Like it messes with the mind. It is confusing and it is paradoxical. So when I started working and doing grief work from my own personal story, from my own personal journey of having my losses from childhood, invisible losses, abstract losses, intangible losses, and non-death related losses, along with death related losses, I always recognized that we were swimming in an ocean of grief. We are swimming in an ocean of grief. And it blew me away. It blew me away. And men aren't taught about grief. And culturally, we're not taught about grief. And we're taught to manage it, solve it, fix it, push it away, get over it, let it go, but
Hmm.
not in the space of letting it breathe, you know? So the compassionate grieving model was something that started to evolve for me from my work personally, but then also my work as a chaplain, working in end of life care, working in like the the sterile experiences of a level one trauma center, working in the ICUs and the trauma bays, in the palliative care on the pediatric side and on the adult side, working in the ICUs, working in inpatient psych, leading groups, and recognizing there is so much unnamed grief. And we are a society in which we all are feeling it. No one is untouched by it. And yet we don't have language for this. Yet we don't have context for this. And we have our intellectualization, our rationalization, our analyzation about how we're thinking about grief but not feeling through it.
Here it
And
is.
I was like, no, we got to change this. And I'll be honest, I've tried to divorce grief many, many times in my life. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, right? Like, I'm in a scenario in which my being was like, why am I dedicating my life to this work? Why would I want to sit in the realm of the dark all the time? Why do I want to sit in the realm of the uncertain all the time? Because while grief is a universal experience that we all share, it is so uniquely individual.
Hmm.
And then I started to understand it on the spiritual level. I started understanding it from a more cosmological level. I started to understand it, and I don't mean in terms of afterlife and those pieces. There is a component to that, but I'm an emotional worker, like I'm in the heart and the trenches within how we process grief emotionally.
Hmm.
And so, then I had to utilize spiritual language to kind of raise it up, to recognize what grief is actually offering us for our humanity. And it's like you said, in our impermanence, right? Like in our impermanence, this recognition of our mortality, the recognition of this time and space in which we live, that is remarkably important for us to be able to lean into. Hey, the meaning that comes in with all this. So I got a lot to share about this, but I wanted to really frame it in that way.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take pause here and give some space for some dialogue between you and I in this way, and then we can jump into that question there, man.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
how did you make the transition from oh, how did this become your vocation? How did this become your daughter? Like, how did this become your, oh, this is what I'm doing? Because no, maybe I'm speaking for myself. No one's like, oh man, I'm so excited to teach grief, man. Let's deal with death. Like, that's not
Yeah.
really the common response. So, what sparked your interest to turn towards what many people turn away from?
Yeah, I think that I couldn't deny it, man. Like for me, there's a personal story to this. I went through several dark nights of the soul in my life. The first being through my childhood and my adolescence. So I was courting death every day, right? Like death was on my mind. There wasn't a day that death didn't come by my mind. And it
Mm,
wasn't just from circumstances of this life, but it was just inside my being. I was in a prison of my own self and my own identity, an identity crisis, being a first generation Indian American, like trying to vibe in with the assimilation of this culture, trying to vibe in with, you know, like divorcing my culture, divorcing things that were really important to my life, my heritage, my ancestry, to try to fit in and belong. That's a big part of my personal story in that way. But I just like right away at a young age, 5 years old, I'm asking questions. What is this life all about? Why are we here? What is this all for? And to
mm,
ask existential questions at a young age is a baffling thing for parents and for other, I got a lot of aunties and uncles. And there was sort of like othered even in my questioning of how I was processing all this.
mm,
So in some ways, my vocation of grief work was an actualization of a part of myself who I've always been, right? Grief work was a self-actualizing process for me. It was a coming to an awareness for me. It was coming into a relationship for me. It was almost coming into a place where I stopped fighting myself and I had ownership about who I am and my work in this world. And so in my own excavation of my own sacred heart about who I am and my work, my dharma in this life, it had to be in relationship to grief work. And I
mm,
and I couldn't deny that. It's the linchpin to all forms of healing. Underneath all the pieces in which we are going with, on the path to enlightenment, on the path to universal love, we will hit grief. We will hit layers of grief. How do we process that? So for me, it becoming a vocation is when I stop fighting myself
mm,
and recognizing my relationship to this work and how it's been a big part of my life. Practically, it's when I started to really shift from being an acupuncturist and working as a Chinese medical practitioner and serving in like in the realm of private practice and in doing my work in that way,
right.
that I said I wanted to merge ministry and medicine together, and I became a chaplain. And that work, when I started to transition into end of life care in the hospital setting, that's when that vocation started to take real form. And that's been now 10 plus years of that relationship of living into that experience. So 15 years of clinical practice, and very specifically over a decade of that being an end of life, death oriented care. I've come to a deeper awareness that the nature of this work is actually called the thanatologist. Thanatologist is a person who studies death, dying, grief, and bereavement. There is no perfect term that describes the exact, in terms of this lifetime, in terms of this reality in which my work is remarkably dedicated towards. Mhm.
Right. I am wondering if you can talk about grief, but also toxic positivity. You know what I mean? So our culture, and I'll also share that I was an existential philosophy major. Like I've been brooding for almost 47 of 50 years. Right? So again, solidarity. I or solidarity, right, Allison? So people don't want to deal with grief, or they want to put a timetable on grief and talk about how that's unnatural, how it's natural to want to put a timetable on it given the constructs of our society, and how to do so is just to perpetuate suffering.
Yeah. So suppression leads to suffering. Okay. Suppression leads to suffering. When we suppress our emotions, we're going to increase suffering in our life. When we bury emotions, we bury them alive, and then we start to lie
Mm,
to ourselves. All
wow.
right. So, so let's talk about grief work. Grief work is liberating work. Grief work leads us towards emotional liberation. Okay. When we start to enter into the realm of grief work, it's actually not dark, it's actually brilliant light. I had to fight this for myself because as a spiritual care provider, emotional spiritual care provider in the hospital setting, I was challenged by my supervisors that say, you are arrogant, you are condescending. And I was like, how so? It's like you bring your knowledge, your education, your old medical background, but you're coming into these circumstances as if you can explain grief and make sense of it for people. You can't.
Mm,
You can't. You got to arrive into that space, or you got to empathically move into the space there. And I was challenged by that. And I said, I thought I was doing it. They're like, no, you're not. And I said, well, how do I do it? And they said, you have to learn to sit in your own dark so that you can sit comfortably in the dark of others. Yeah. So it was in that existential invitation
yep.
at a deeper way in which I recognize my own toxic positivity, right? To to hold back from a deeper and enriching experience, thinking that if I went towards the light, if I went towards positivity, if I went towards reframing everything towards a positive lens, somehow I was noticing in my own meditative experience, the dark was coming in, which meant the things that were unfulfilled in my life, the things that were incomplete in my life, the old wounds, the traumas, the pains, the unresolved kept coming to my mind. And I said, why is it that I'm going towards, searching towards enlightenment and inner peace, and yet all this unresolved pain is there? Let me meditate more. Let me chant more. Let me do more breathing exercises. Let me go do more rituals, more ceremonies. Maybe that'll be rid of all that.
Mm.
And it wasn't the case.
Oh,
The
dude.
more I suppressed, the more I bypassed, the more I was in toxic positivity, the more that dark, seemingly dark, was coming to me. It was only until I started to embrace that dark and recognize the two enemies of this equation, judgment, shame, and I might say stigma, yeah, were the things that were holding me back from this reality. So then I started to embrace the dark because I couldn't do my work professionally as a chaplain unless I sat within it. And through the deep, dark nights of my own personal work and trudging through, and not to get to a place of healed, but to bring in awareness and compassion and gentleness into that equation, everything started to change. When I entered into the deep dark, that's when the light started to come. The light in the form of peace, the light in the form of spiritual insight, the light in form of poetic understanding, the light that exists as understanding the sweet spot between the paradoxes that the mind seeks to understand and create in the world. I started to find the experiences that my heart can hold what my mind couldn't understand. I could feel and experience my soul through lifetimes and understand the nature of my work in a powerful way to understand my purpose and how it's going to be evolving through time and seeing things from a much more dimensional reality when I started to embrace the seemingly dark of grief work.
I'm just going to pause for the mic and the wisdom that you just dropped right there. So thank you for that compassionate rendering of like how you got there. Um, I wanted to back up, and then I know we have some questions, but like another question that came to mind is I want you to help for those of us who are newer to grief work. Um, you, I taught some students a couple weeks ago, and so 17. So I love teaching high school age students. I love teenage angst, especially when they ask questions. When there's the 15-year-old has arms folded and it's grilling you with existential questions. I'm just like, hi. I guess that's what I looked like when I was a kid. But this one beautiful young child was like, Reggie, you talk a lot about grief and loss in your work, and I honor and respect that. But how do we get through it? And I was just like, dear one, how do we get past it? I was like, no, there's no getting past it. You have to get through it.
Yeah.
And we have to get through it together. So our culture wants you to rationalize grief and put it on a timetable and do it by yourself. So how do you in your work normalize grief, express the feeling of it? Because you can't think your way out of a grief cycle. You have to let the feelings come and do what they do so they can change over time. So how do you address the tendency to think and analyze as opposed to feel and just be?
Yeah. Feeling is healing. All right. Feeling is healing, but we don't know how to feel. We know how to think. We don't drown in our emotions. We drown in our thoughts about our emotions. All right. So the realm is that the head is hijacking the heart all the time. Why? Because we got mind body dualism, right? Descartes says, I think, therefore I am,
Terrible.
right? There is exactly, right? There's a reality in which this Cartesian methodology over the last hundreds of years that built the Enlightenment era to the Protestant work ethic, to the Industrial Revolution, to capitalism, that we have suppressed systematically this very normal and natural experience of our emotions that has led to us to have emotion phobia. Yeah. Emotions themselves, right? Difficult and unprocessed emotions, unfamiliar emotions for us is like as if we have basic biology. We're like, we're we're in the forest, we're in the jungle, and a lion comes. Are we gonna fight or are we gonna flight? Yeah, we're gonna freeze, we're gonna fawn. How are we gonna respond to this lion? That lion has now been attributed to unprocessed, unfamiliar emotions. We are having the same physiological response, yeah, to our emotions as if we are in a jungle or in a forest and a lion is right there about to attack us. When we have a relationship to our emotions that exists with that kind of survival mechanism, grief is unattainable for us. That is why grief is so overwhelming and powerful. How is it that we move through grief? How is it we got to do it? We got to develop emotional safety amidst our emotion phobia. And that itself is a somatic process first. Yeah, that is a physiological component. We got to apply breath exercises, movement exercises, breathing practices. We got to develop relationship. We change the relationship of grief that feels this big to us, and we're only this big, this tidal wave of an emotion, and recognize that we need to be bigger in relationship to it. Now, how do we do that with grief? You got to incorporate the multidimensional perspective. This is actually foundational to the compassionate grieving model. For those who don't know, this work has evolved for me to synthesize a multidimensional, multifaceted perspective that I call the compassionate grieving model that exists as the Institute for Compassionate Grieving, compassionategrieving.com. And that work holds the multi-layered complexity of it. One, we have to pay attention to emotional blueprints. How are we taught about emotions? What are our belief systems about emotions? What was allowed, what was not allowed? What are some of our myths, and what are these emotional obstacle courses that we are going through? And that's going to be different dependent on culture and parental background and society at large, right? These are emotional blueprints that we take with us. Secondly, we got to recognize that we got to have mindfulness of emotions. We got to recognize that grief itself is not an emotion. It's a response that comes with multiple emotions at the same time. And that barrage of many emotions that are coming in at the same time is overwhelming to a person who has no emotional literacy or grief literacy. So we got to check that we have a grief illiterate culture and that we are taught out of our emotions. The first loss that most people feel is actually a loss of innocence because we're taught not how to feel. For men, anger is the only emotion that's allowed to be expressed. For women, it might be sadness, right? So we're not taught the vast spectrum of emotions that are coming. And grief itself is not an emotion. It's a response that comes with multiple emotions at the same time. So we got to develop a curiosity about our emotional space. We got to develop a curiosity about how we feel. We got to bring in non-judgment, non-shaming practices that are about curiosity and wonderment. Then in that next phase, we develop emotional fitness. Emotional fitness is about how to develop strength in our emotional body, learn how to actually feel. And that's where somatic relief for grief comes in. Somatic relief for grief is using a formula, breath, rhythm, and movement that I have grounded within Chinese medical Qigong and old ancient yogic practices that utilize a way to develop internal safety so that we could feel without being overwhelmed, feel without feeling that survival mechanism that comes in. You see, when we start to package grief and understand this sort of multifaceted relationship, we were recognizing that the first steps to doing grief work is unlearning what we've been taught about grief, right? We got to unlearn what we've been taught about it. We got to come into a new relationship. The tragedy of this situation, though, Reggie, that I feel so overwhelmed by, it makes me so sad for every person, is that we tend to only do grief work when grief hits. And that is overwhelming. That is overwhelming. That is the sadness of all of it. Most of us aren't doing grief work outside of a tragedy. We are forced into it and thus forced to learn how to do grief work. So inner peace isn't the absence of emotions. Inner peace is our confidence to be with big and large emotions, comfortably and confidently. So grief work is a multifaceted kind of experience. Those things that I shared with you, the step-by-step process, is those first foundations. Then when we start to get past this emotion phobia to emotional safety, then we can start applying grief-oriented technique, right? Then we can start to process grief in a much more of an effective way. We can start to apply grief principles that are associated with regret and disappointment, working with different emotions like anger or different forms of suppression, working with fear, working with uncertainty, working with each one of those big emotions that come up in our grief response is inherently its own technique, its own training, its own story. But I'll finish with this.
Yeah.
Grief itself is not a problem. It is itself a natural and normal response. Why? Because grief is always a story of love. As much as we grieve is as much love that was there. Yeah, it's a direct proportionality to each other. If there's no love, there's not going to be grief. If there's great love, there's going to be great grief. So if we reframe grief as a story of love, a love story, then that starts to change this heavy, weighted, solid piece that breaks through our heart, creates this vacuous experience of our heart, and just feels, like that feeling inside that is hollow and empty. It starts to transform into this flow. And what we want to do with grief is trajectory. We want it to be a river. We want it to flow. So letting go is actually about creating flow. Breath, rhythm, and movement. Somatic relief for grief. This is how we vibe into this.
I know that we're going to have a somatic practice later in our time together. A question that came up in the chat was from Vidya Ananda. Vidya Ananda asks, says, AmarAtma, I love so much the wisdom that you share about your grief work. Question, I'm also trained to be a hospital chaplain, and I love the grief work, but felt like that within the context, we're cutting off so many tools that yoga brings to the work. How do you bring all of your yoga insights and other insights to make it work within that harsh Judeo-Christian medical paradigm?
The first thing that I would say to that, and that's a great question, is recognizing that so much of the yoga and the meditation is actually off the mat. It's actually how we live, right? And so living the teachings is an important part of anybody who's doing service-based work. But when you're a chaplain, you're literally in the experience of uncertainty in any specific moment. You are walking into the most gruesome and most horrible grief experiences, and you might do that 20 times a day, right? So in some ways, it's not how we apply the practice of breathing exercises or yoga techniques or asanas within the chaplain care. It's how we work to embody it so that our presence becomes the healer in a space. This is based on a polyvagal theory. You see, I'm a Sikh, and when I walked into a space, people weren't excited to see a chaplain that looked like me, right? Let's be honest, man. I'm one board certified Sikh chaplain in the country. There might be others, but when I got board certified, I was the one and only, right? And so, I go into a room, people are like, whoa, whoa, one, we don't want a chaplain. Second, we don't want this
With you, right?
terrorist looking Muslim guy to be coming into the space here, right? And I was in Phoenix. That means we had snowboarders from people from all across the country,
God
right? Who have
bless.
never seen a Sikh before.
Oh Lord.
So I knew my presence had to be bigger than their thoughts, than their judgments, than their experience. I knew that I was there to serve them. So I had to go so deep within myself so I can go low so we can raise them up. My practice led to my presence being a healer. And
Mm,
that work, I'll be honest, I'm not trying to be arrogant here, but I got awards for my work. Why? Because I had to work harder than any other Judeo-Christian person who was vibing into the chaplain experience because they didn't have to work as hard as me because they didn't look different, right?
right.
So I had to like lean into that. So to answer that question, I would teach breathing exercises. I might do a little bit of Reiki, a little bit of touch, in terms of my support and care, especially when I'm working with the family. I like put a hand on a shoulder to provide that. But it was really polyvagal theory and neuroception and understanding the impact of how people are assessing threat and safety at a precognitive level that my practice created a healing presence. And it was that way that I started to change my practice, grow my practice to make it so that I lived the asana, I lived the pranayama, I lived the the chant, the mantra, so that I could be able to have that serve me as it served them in that particular situation. Because I tell you, in those scenarios, there's no joke. There's no joke.
I mean, you can imagine like the name of my teaching practice is called Active Peace because I know that my presence has to be so peaceful because in many
Yeah.
circumstances, like I stand 6'2". I'm like 290. I'm a big dude.
Yeah.
So like the way this culture conditions you to think, you're
Yeah.
not conditioned to be peaceful around me.
Yeah.
My
Truth.
my energy has to be so zoom.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. Like it hits you precognitively.
That's right.
It
That's
has to
right.
hit you precognitively.
Yeah, the presence has to be larger than their thoughts, larger than their fears, and that's okay. That was an invitation. I don't judge or
Oh no, for sure.
shame anybody, but it's true in this culture. I had a great teacher of mine. He was about a 6'5" black man as well. He's a martial artist, and
Mm,
I used to do work with him, and it was weird to walk around with him. And we would go to the movies, we go to restaurants, and this guy was talking to everybody on the elevator, in the restaurant. And I was like, man, you talk to everybody. Like you were just there. And he's like, yeah, because I want to always put people at ease. And I was like, oh my God, bro. Like it hit me. And it was during my chaplain years that I learned this. And it was him as a martial artist and him as a big black man that taught me about the power of presence. Now, I ain't that big. I'm 5'6", 160 pounds. Like I ain't a big stature man, but I had to make my presence big so that kindness, that love, that beauty would come across. I have so many stories about this that I could talk about in chaplaincy around that because that stuff is so powerful. But I feel you, man. I feel you on your vibe on this.
yeah, another question that Kim brings to us is, can you share thoughts on collective grief? In a recent interview, Priya Parker said this: we're living through a time of massive unacknowledged collective grief, and we have neither the language nor the rituals
Yeah,
to process what it is we're going through.
yeah.
Like, what grief work do you do for individual and collective levels?
Yeah, so this is an important piece of the compassionate grieving model, right? The compassionate grieving model has to contain collective grief. Why? Because collective grief, what used to be separate from us from a distance, and we used to have space between the personal and collective, that line is thin. The collective is overwhelming the personal is overwhelming the collective. So Kenneth Doka coined this term, disenfranchised grief. Okay.
Mm,
We have to learn how to name losses besides death related losses. We got
preach.
to name the types of losses that are intangible and abstract: loss of innocence, loss of identity, right? Loss of stability, loss of safety, right? These are abstract losses that we got to recognize. We got to recognize the non-death related grief: loss of friendships, loss of relationships, rejections, health related losses, education related losses, money related losses, spiritual community related losses, right? There are many layers of losses that are there. I identify over 80 different types of losses that I work with people on because we have to recognize that while death-related loss is by far the most powerful and impactful, it is not the only type of loss that we grieve, right? So there are many layers of grief, right? that we feel personally for ourselves. It's like we're all carrying an invisible backpack of losses that are like boulders, rocks, pebbles, and sand. And some of these sand, these like minor and micro losses. I don't know if you've ever carried a bag of sand. That stuff's heavy, man.
Yeah, man.
Right? So we got a lot of losses that are unprocessed, and grief is cumulative. So we got to recognize that when we have a loss, we're not just experiencing this loss only. We're experiencing this loss and all the other losses that we haven't experienced because grief is opportunistic. It's
Oh man.
cumulative and opportunistic. They all want to be at the table. They all want healing. And
Hmm.
that's natural because the body's based on homeostasis. It's trying to get to a place of harmony and balance. And we suppress. So they're like, oh, our losses come in. We're all running to the table. Heal me, heal me, heal me, right?
Yep.
Yeah. But then we got collective loss. We got societal loss, right? We got losses that are minimized. We got things that are happening on the other side of the world that we are feeling. The collective is so much more connected to us now than it ever used to be. And that's through social media, to 24-hour news cycles. That stuff is very, very powerful. So how do we work with collective loss? Firstly, we want to recognize that we want to name collective losses.
Hmm.
What are the types of losses we have? Anytime we do any emotional based work, we got to name it first. Name the loss, name the emotions. Every loss is going to come with their own bevy of emotions. Most of the time, it's going to be around fear. So, fear is going to be a foundational experience. So, to do grief work, we got to also embrace fear. All right. So, we got to recognize this journey. The collective losses are all over the place, man. They're so powerful. It's so overwhelming what we're feeling. And this world has so much anticipation. We got this apocalyptic. We don't even know what 1 week to the next week is going to be. We don't know if it's going to be nuclear wars. We don't know if it's going to be a natural disaster. We got climate change. Man, it is crazy. And I think about the children of this time and
Man.
the kind of uncertainty that they're living with on a day in and day out basis. No wonder why suicide rates are high. No wonder why depression is there. No wonder why ADHD is off the charts, right? There we got all this unprocessed collective grief that we're asking our children and we call them entitled. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't like that.
Right.
I don't like that. But they're carrying a burden that we didn't ever do in our generations, right? We didn't process those emotions. We didn't do the healing work. So now we pass it on to our future generations and they got to carry that. And that's very difficult work for them, you know? So collective grief is real, man. Like this is good. I'm not sure if I answered the question exactly. Was there a specific question in there?
Oh, I mean, I think just the distinction of what it is, I think the way that you broke it down granularly was
Yeah.
beautiful. I can speak to the opportunistic point in grief when Corey died. I was a grief that I thought that I was over from a relationship that was 10 years prior was just like, hey, can we talk now? I'm like, nah, I'm mourning my brother. Nah, it's just this whole I developed such a sense of humor when
Yeah.
with my own grief because I was just like, you slick. I didn't even know you were over there. Like, how'd you get up in here? I thought it was about court. Like it's just
Nah.
the opportunistic. I never heard of it that way, but I
Yeah.
totally experienced it that way.
Yeah, the thing is that, from an energetic point of view, I come from a Chinese medical perspective. The thing about losses, when it's like that in that grief backpack, is that it becomes emotional indigestion and emotional constipation.
Sure.
Yeah. That becomes too many losses trying to process it at the same time. So to work with personal grief, to work with personal losses, to work with collective losses, we got to learn how to make it smaller. We got to differentiate, distinguish, yeah, and decipher between what it is that we're talking about. That requires like a more sophisticated emotional intelligence, right? Like you're able to decipher between an old girlfriend, right, an old partner, and your brother that had died. You could be able to see that if we can recognize losses that are happening at the same time, we we don't get overwhelmed by the tidal wave when we can make grief smaller, right? That's how we can digest this process. So the work I do with people, whether it's a one-on-one basis or through retreats or through courses, through workshops, is helping to make grief smaller by naming the different types of losses. And in doing so, we can say, all right, what are we going to work on now? What are we specifically going to target now? Let's make this simpler, smaller, and more effective for us. And as we start to grow the muscle of grief work, right, we start to get confident in our ability, it becomes very simple, very easy. Almost grief work can happen in minutes because we're not afraid to feel. We're using somatic principles to breathe through. We're recognizing that grief happens in multiple layers, and we say, oh, okay, this changes my relationship then.
One emotion that consistently gets equated with grief and often misunderstood is anger. So, could you talk about how anger relates to grief and the relationship that you've seen there from your experience?
Absolutely. You know, the five stages of grief. By the way, I just gotta take a pause here. I'm vibing, man. Like I'm talking fast. I'm like throwing out things. I hope everybody is in appreciation because I'm just feeling like just on a roll. And Reggie, I'm just feeling with you and just
Yeah.
feeling your
Oh, the
love, your
chat's on
questions.
fire. Now we're
Yeah. Yeah,
like,
it's the thing that's happening. All right. So I just want to take a pause and just be in the receptivity of the love that is just unfolding in this moment. It's very, very rich to me, right? So, as you know, I love talking about grief. I have no problem jumping into this. And so, let's talk about anger. All right. Anger. Anger is part of the five stages of grief. And I don't like the five stages of grief. I never really bought into that, man.
same
Not
here.
only do I don't think that we grieve in categories neatly. I don't think it's linear either. And anger is the only emotion that's used within the five stages of grief. We say depression is an emotion. It's not. Depression is a DSM categorization, right? It's a clinical diagnosis. So I don't like that kind of a component around where anger kind of comes in within all this.
Right.
Anger is an important part of grief work. I think of anger in multiple ways. One, anger is a nondescript emotional word, just like sadness, just like fear. Those are generalized. We got to expand. Are you enraged? Are you are you frustrated? Are you annoyed? Are you mad? Are you bitter? Are you violated? What is the type of anger we're feeling,
Love
right?
it.
So mindfulness of emotions and how to name emotions is really about an opportunity for us to get clear about what it is we're feeling. Now, anger, I mean, I can go in a lot of different directions around anger, but you know, anger to me, there's also a very somatic component to it. There's hot anger, there's anger that comes from deficiency, there's anger that comes from stagnation, and then there's cold anger. So there's four different types of anger that we can vibe with too. Hot anger is a person who's like a pitta predominant person. I'm using a little Ayurvedic language here. You know, it's like somebody who's naturally like their first thing is anger. They're just sharp, they're just frustrated, they're just angry. They have like anger. It's like that's like their dominant emotion. They just come in hot, they just run hot, right? They're just fire. They're all fire. They're like a
My
dragon.
brother.
They're fire, right? So what I would say to someone like that, we got to cool it down. We might use some Sipali pranayama. We want to do some twisting motion practice to kind of like a damn towel. We got to wring it out, right? And that's going to help the liver in that kind of a way. So that's very important for us. But we also want to recognize what is anger masking as a major emotion.
There you go.
So what's underneath anger? Not only do we feel on a spectrum, we also feel in a vertical flow. What's a predominant emotion and what's underneath, like an iceberg. Then we have anger that's associated with deficiency. Most of us are pretty burnt out. Most of us are tired. Most of us are living in chronic stress. Most of us are pretty depleted. Yeah. And often the time we get anger and sharp and irritable because we're tired, we're hangry, we don't have enough energy. And so for anger type that exists in that way, we need deep rest. We need permission to relax. We need to stop pushing. We need to stop creating pressure in our life, right? Then there's anger from stagnation. Now, anger can sometimes come across because we're masking and suppressing other emotions. When you suppress emotions, right, you're creating stagnation internally.
Yep.
Stagnation means you're creating emotional inflammation that's creating a rub within your energetic flow. And that rub is creating a bit of heat, and that heat is anger. So sometimes we have to recognize that anger is a reflection of suppression.
That's
Yeah. We're like a like a pressure cooker that doesn't have a release valve, and you're just gonna blow up, right? Like I'm a 9 on the Enneagram. So I want peace. I'm looking for peace. Peace is my thing. I don't want confrontation. I want peace. But when I don't process my emotions well, I blow up. And my wife knows this. She's like, oh, there he goes. He's been holding it in all this time. He has been saying this in our therapy sessions. He has been talking to me about this. He's been holding on to it for a month, and now he blows up at me. That's what I do, right? That's from stagnation, right? And then cold anger, cold anger. Maya Angelou talks about this. She did this really great interview with Dave Chappelle on Iconoclast. I posted this a while ago. And she talked about not letting anger get to bitterness. Yeah,
Hmm.
that's a cold anger. She says bitterness makes you hold a grudge and it's resentful. And resentful is very, very toxic. It's internally toxic.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's like anger that goes to coldness. And that becomes very, very frozen inside. Yeah. And it eats you from the inside out and it perpetuates fear. So for that type of anger, we got to move. We got to thaw that baby out. We got to make that happen. We got to get a little bit of heat in there, and then it turns to heat, and then we got to process it through the heat wave process. So there's a lot that I could say about anger. So I hope I answered that piece there.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I mean, most people when they think about anger don't even think of it in terms of the ways that you articulated it, right? So just thank you for that breakdown. And just for in the mindfulness of emotions, I remember when I was training in mindfulness of emotions, the whole goal is to expand your vocabulary,
Yeah.
right? If you expand your vocabulary, then you can find different ways to address, attack, ameliorate, whatever, you know. But
Yeah.
if it's just one thing, then there's only that kind of limits. Another
Yeah.
question that's come up in the chat is, can you speak to grief as it impacts us at different ages and how we may tend to ourselves in each other in the different stages of life?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Obviously, as we grow up with more age, we're going to have more loss as a part of our life because we have just more life experiences,
Yeah,
right? We may have had like layoffs, may have been through recessions, we may go through like being house poor, we may have lost friends along the way, we may have more debts, we may have more breakups, people who are at a certain age start to have a lot more people dying. It becomes normalized, in their geriatric, more aging process. I have one of my clients and I can tell it was like she's in her 70s. She went to like 5 or 6 funerals within a month's time because so many of the people in her close vicinity or her community were dying. And I was like, wow. So we were processing not just the grief of the people that she lost, but having to attend all these kind of experiences, right? So that's not to say though that age people don't have a lot like a 15-year-old can have more losses in one lifetime,
totally, totally,
So it's all very, very relative. You think about people in war-torn areas, right, around the world, like the kind of losses that they're experiencing. I mean, that's what breaks my heart the most,
for sure.
right? Children experiencing the losses that they
War,
have in war-torn areas, like one, there's grief. Second, there's trauma. You know what I'm saying? And grief and trauma are not the same thing, but they're sisters, you know? And
right?
that impacts me the most of anything in that kind of a way, man. Like that is so tragic to me, the kind of grief, because I know grief and I know what it's going to do to the brain, I know what it's going to do with the body, and I know how it's going to affect life expectancy and disease and chronic illness later on in life. So sad. The biggest thing that we want to do when grieving is happening, when we're supporting another person, is to provide gentleness and compassion. We don't know the stories people are carrying. And most people don't know the stories that they're carrying in their bodies either, right? So when grief is happening for a person, we want to recognize that they're not experiencing one loss, they're experiencing multiple losses at the same time. Our
Right.
ability to ask a great question, to let stories unfold, is very, very helpful to a griever if you can sit and listen well. If you can't sit and listen well, I would just say remove yourself from the circumstance. Don't offer a platitude. Don't try to fix it. God will give you more than you can handle, or they're in a better place, or time heals all wounds. Like, nah, none of that. That's so condescending and patronizing. Like we don't want to do any of that.
And tone deaf.
Yeah, very tone deaf in that way. Somebody shared something really special with me. Don't say I'm sorry. Say I'm sorrow with you. I
Wow.
love that. Man, that's so good. You
Right.
know? Yeah. The skill of listening is by holding peaceful presence, but it's also your ability to ask good questions. So if you're wanting to support somebody who's, elderly, who's carrying a lot of grief, they got a whole lifetime of stories that they might want to share. And most people want to be seen and heard, just like emotions want to be seen and heard. Let's create some opportunity for them to be seen and heard by listening well and letting their stories be shared. And you'll be surprised how remarkably therapeutic and healing that is for them to be able to have a voice to somebody who'll listen. Most of the time we grieve alone. We just carry that story in ourselves. And we're right, we suppress it. So we carry it in our bodies. So this is kind of the story I would like to have in terms of like age-related grief. Now, there's more to say about that on a lot of levels because there's developmental psychology as well. So children who experience grief will experience grief and express grief in different ways based on different ages. Say a 3 to 5 year old, a 5 to 7 year old, a 7 to 10 year old, 10 to 12 year old, or 13-year-old, and then 13 to 15 to 16, 16 to 18, and then 18 and above, right? So this developmental psychology will have different expressions about grief there. Like a younger kid might like in their 6 years old, might pee in bed more, but that's not going to be the same thing for a 16-year-old. They may be more withdrawn and be hanging out with friends or exploring more, like adventurous kind of lifestyle because they're trying to flirt and understand death's reality and their own impermanence. So we got to understand that aging from 3 to 18 years old, maybe to 22 years old, is multi-layered in terms of developmental psychology. So that's a bigger conversation in its own time.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying this. So two more questions, and then I know that you had a practice that you wanted to share with us.
Sure.
And I don't want our conversation to deprive people of tools that you may have to offer in medicine in that way. So one question that has been coming up a lot in the chat, and you talked a little bit about it, but I'm wondering if you can go deeper, is how do you deal with anticipatory grief? So how do you prepare for the unknown? Is essentially what I think the question is getting to.
Anticipatory grief is one of the most major unnamed grief that we have. We are often experiencing many losses before the actual loss occurs, right? And the mind, you know, grief work is time bending work. We are time benders, those who do grief work, right? So we're working with the past and the future all at the same time, right?
Right.
And so understanding that in the realm of grief, we are working in the realm of time bending. So our mind is anticipating what a future is going to be without a person or without something being there. And that's a natural experience. We want to honor that. What is anticipatory grief truly offering us if we think of grief as a rishi or as a maharishi or as a teacher? Mindfulness. Grieving is one of the most powerful forms of mindfulness practice. To me, grieving is the most purest form of mindfulness practice. What I think that we're trying to get from a mindfulness practice actually comes through really deep-hearted grieving.
I believe
Yeah.
that.
Because if grief is a story of love, yeah, then love is teaching us how to be present in
Present.
the moment and what matters most.
Right now.
So
Right.
anticipatory grief is saying there's a loss that's going to be coming into the future. I'm experiencing it now. It's unknown. My natural place to go is to fear. Let me embrace it. Let me lean into it. Let me let that grief breathe and let me honor it with absolute presence. Yeah. To be right there, fully alive, fully alive, alive. That's the gift of grief work. Aliveness. Yeah. And anticipatory grief is one of the first teachers of that process because the loss hasn't happened. I can't tell you how many people I've worked with over the years. They said, I wish I started doing grief work before I lost my person. I wish I had these tools of recognizing mindfulness, emotion, somatic relief for grief, emotional blueprints, all these techniques around the compassionate grieving model that they can live into it. Because most of the time we're managing anticipatory grief. We're buffering, we're bypassing. We don't want to be impacted by it. Yeah. But if we lean into it a little bit, we provide some safety. Yeah. We go into it and we rumble with that grief. It'll build us through into this really special relationship of being fully present. And that can be a massive gift and it'll take away regret as well. Oh my God, I don't relieve you of regret. It's so good. But it's intense though, right? Like anticipatory grief is a real thing. I think a lot of us have, a lot of aging family members, right? And so there's a story of grief that is happening. I utilize grief as a way to teach me about how to live. Yeah. I mean, that's a very common thing to say, like death conscious work and grief informed work is about how to live with greater aliveness in this work. I call that piece of the compassionate grieving model the unscripted life. It's my translation of dharmic living, right?
Right.
How do we live boldly with greater and maybe even a little bit of awkward love, like loving more awkwardly. So I'll say this thing because I know that Allison brought up the snake.
Yeah.
To me, grief work is like vibing with the snake. All right. There's a really powerful line as a Sikh that we have in one of our scriptures. It's saying, I'll translate it for you. You don't kill the snake, but you remove the venom in the teeth. Right? The snake is always going to be a part of life. Let's not be scared of it. But grief work is being able to vibe in with the snake reality. But the venom, they don't bite. It doesn't poison you anymore. And when you can have a relationship to grief work outside of fear, it is very, very enriching. And there's something very interesting about snake skin. How is it that a snake skin can flow without things attaching to it? Snake is flowing through, rubble,
Yeah.
sand, gravel, grass, but yet nothing particularly sticks with it. What's up with that? Being able to be slick like a snake with snake skin in terms of attachment is very, very powerful. But it doesn't come without grief work. You know what I'm saying? Like
Right.
attachment, most people get into this realm of attachment, detachment. I don't think letting go. I don't like the way we think about letting go. Just like we have a whole conversation about grief, there's a whole conversation about letting go.
Totally.
Yeah, like grieving is an essential life skill we've never been taught. letting go is an essential life skill we've also not been taught.
Correct.
So there's this whole thing about the snake vibe that I was really vibing with Allison about that. I don't want to just bring that in, even though it's a little out of context.
Go for it.
Yeah, cool. All right, how are we all doing here in the chat?
I think we're caught up on the chat. Like one question I wanted to ask before segueing into your practice is how do you see grief work as connected to social justice, especially for communities of color, the global majority?
Yeah, so this is an important question, right? This goes back to this disenfranchised grief, right? So we swim in an ocean of grief, and that ocean is polluted by shame, all right? We swim in an ocean of grief, a lot of unnamed and invisible losses, and that ocean is polluted by shame. Yet the thing is that the social justice process around systemic issues, the systemic grief, is that grief is everywhere. Losses are everywhere. Yeah. And we recognize that shame is actually what's imprisoning grief inside our heart. And that shame is associated with patriarchy and colonization. Right. That's the issue there. We're having to unlearn not only how we thought about grief, but patriarchy and colonization within our life. The social justice aspect is recognizing systemic racism, systemic grief are all deeply intertwined together. And it's held and bound by shame. You know, thoughts of low self-worth, thoughts of self-limiting, thoughts of feeling small. That is something I've had to deeply decolonize. I'm a very visible person. I hate being visible. I have fought being visible. I've hated it. My wife, she's like, come on, go stand up. I'm like, like I was taught to be invisible. I was taught to be behind the scenes, never the star, never the main character of a movie, never, no, Sikh men in American cinema. Like what? You know? Now we're starting to vibe like South Asian culture, you know, we're getting a little Bhangra action happening and people are all about it, you know, it's all good, right? But back in the day, like, no, that wasn't like that. So visibility is an important part of our story, and it's about the story of identity, a story about how our cultures have had oppression. And so having to hold space for systemic grief, disenfranchised grief, grief that is non-death related is an important part of social justice practice. When we could name that grief, and start doing grief work, we're going to develop a profound amount of resiliency. We're going to develop, you know, when we have frontline workers who are working in the world of social justice, they need energy. They need vitality. They need to be juiced by a spiritual source. Grieving in the form of shame from colonization and systemic racism and all that is stealing that energy. It's stealing that vital energy. Through grieving, we can reclaim that energy for greater work and do it in a powerful way. There's a lot to say about this.
I love that. And like I'd love to all offline. Social justice is my work, grief is my work. Like I want to collab mentally with you about that because I hold grief circles for social justice workers. So
Yeah,
like
that's the
talk
vibe, man.
about that.
Yeah.
I'm ready for it.
Yeah, and
Um,
naming those like intangible losses and those like societal losses is a big part of that equation. You know, like it's not just the personal losses, but the collective losses we hold within that.
right.
Yeah.
I want to combine our last two questions in the spirit of the people who have named grief that they're currently holding in the chat. So someone mentioned a grief they hold from the loss of their father 9 years ago. Other folks
Yeah.
have talked about losses they're holding. Allison has mentioned like a recent loss of her mother. So there are people who have come to this experience for tools and techniques about grief. So the I'll merge all the questions and segue to the practice is you've talked about grief being a portal that we step into, not something that we should be ashamed about.
Yeah.
So what are your what teachings and lineages do you hold to help you see that as a portal? And what can you teach us about accessing it as a portal?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
And I hold love for the people who have had major losses in their life and that are carrying them with this into this conversation and you know, deep love and reverence for your journey personally and collectively in that way. If grief is a story of love, love itself is a spiritual energy. And all traditions, all faith traditions, spiritual traditions carry love as a powerful force. So as we create an opportunity for loving as an expression of our grieving, which means reclaiming old memories, which means not just letting go, which means not just moving on, which means creating ceremony and ritual around death anniversaries and birthday anniversaries, holiday events, not as not as a place of trying to just get over it, but a place in which we reclaim as a form of an attachment. That is a very loving act. The way that I recognize this work is from many faith traditions. I'm a chaplain, so I studied many faith traditions, but it really comes back to me being a Sikh. Yeah, me being a Sikh. Sikh itself is a death conscious experience in a very powerful way. So, as a Sikh, within my experience, it's a very death conscious faith. I don't believe that death ends a relationship. I think it changes a relationship. And there's a relationship to be had outside of grief, outside of death. And I like that. I like I like the opportunity of connecting with mediums. I like the opportunity of connecting with people on the other side. I like having an ongoing relationship with them. I've done a lot of ancestral healing. I've done a lot of intergenerational healing. And through my work, I've come to find something that in the connection of ancestral power and intergenerational power, the sacrifices my ancestors have made that allowed me to be able to do what I do, be who I am, live the way I live, have the thoughts and the luxuries and the privileges to be able to say the things I say, do the work I do. That's a very powerful force for me. You know, I think that this portal is really a portal of love. The heart can hold what the mind can't understand. And so it's about reclaiming the power of our hearts that allow us to journey into that. Whatever faith tradition we might carry, whatever spiritual tradition we might carry, there's an opportunity of feeling a very spiritual ascension through the heart in which love can flow through. So for me, I draw on a lot of faith traditions that inform this particular work. But as a Sikh, I found that it's not just love, but divine purpose. That's a big part of it for me. You know, like divine purpose is a big part of what fuels who I am as a person and allows me to love with great depth because it's not just love for the people that are close to me, it's love for humanity. And that's, I just hold humanity in my heart in that way. I hope that answers that question.
It's good for me. So just now, thank you. Well, I want to pause with gratitude for the fluidity of our connection, the fluidity of the engagement of the audience. Like the chat has been on fire. For the way that y'all vulnerably shared in the chat, and AmarAtma, the way you vulnerably shared from your experience. I know that you had wanted to share a couple somatic practice with us, given that most people
Yeah.
think grief is a cerebral experience, but you and I both know you sometimes you got to get it out of the body. So share with us tools, especially for those who've articulated a desire to shift their orientation with grief here with us now. Share something with us on somatic understanding.
Yeah, that's right. So I call this somatic relief for grief. It's an upcoming book and it's a journey that I want to share with you all. So let's recognize that the body grieves. And when we bury emotions, we bury them alive. And it's the body that holds that. So compassionate grieving, the compassionate grieving models holds compassion for the body as well. So let's do some exercises together that allows for some spaciousness to allow our grief to breathe and allow our body to move and flow within each other so that we can be able to relate into this relationship of helping to heal the part of our body that holds all this and can access and change our relationship to grief. Let's begin first by taking a nice deep breath, raising arms up over the head, and then exhale. Good. Remember that the first practice of letting go is in the exhale breath. And release. Good. Throw it to the ground. Grab all the pain, all the suffering, all the things that your body has held. Inhale, hold it, and then exhale, release. Let's do that 2 more times. Deep breath. Release. One last time. Gather it up. Inhale. And release. Beautiful. Beautiful. Now the lungs and grief are very much tied together, right? The lungs hold grief. All right. Why? Because grief constricts the ribs and the shoulders and the diaphragm, the abdomen. It gets us into fetal position because it's based in fear. Yeah. Grief, we don't just feel the achiness in our chest because of our heart. We feel it in our chest because of our lungs being so impacted. So we got to move the lungs. We got to breathe and let it do it. So let's use the lung channel, the lung meridian to help create some flow for our grief. Now this part of our thumbs is very gushy, right? Yeah, it's very gushy. Good. Now I want you to start to move your hands and shake out your wrist from this gushy area of your thumbs. Good. Start to whip your thumbs. Good. Good. Let's make a little bit of a dance. Even though I'm sitting, let's make a little bit of a dance, you know? Let's get the body just flowing and moving a little bit. Yeah, we've been sitting, we've been talking heavy. Yeah, we got a lot happening, right? All right, good. Now we're going to raise our arms up over the head, and we're going to continue to shake, right? And we're going to inhale here, and then we're going to exhale. Bring the arms down with a long sigh. Discharge the energy with a sigh. All right, let's inhale. And exhale. Good. Shake it out. Last time. Good. Now a smooth inhale. Arms up. And then drop it. Exhale. Deep breath. Exhale. Deep breath. And release. Good. Now put your palms on your lap, palms facing up, and just allow your hands to feel the tingling and the warmth. Good. Let your body relax and integrate. Good. The first practices of somatic relief for grief is grounded in discharging excess emotional energy held within the body. We do deep breaths with deep exhales and shaking to release. And every time we do a big discharge practice, we replenish with more oxygenation. It's literally a revitalization of our body, mind, and spirit. And it's in this integration in which letting go really happens. And how we move into uncertainty is a practice of integration. Letting go isn't a chopping block of detachment. It ain't no race to some sort of artificial finish line. Nah, letting go is a practice of integration. It's in this pause, this moment here, integration happens. Good. Good. I'd like you to place one hand right in the center of your chest, the other hand over it. This is a practice based on heart math. It's heart-focused breathing. Let's develop some coherence together. Regulate our nervous system, change our relationship to grief by reclaiming the power of the heart. Remember, the heart can hold what the mind can't understand. Grief work is a journey of 18 inches from our head all the way down into our heart. So let's breathe together. Begin by inhaling and exhaling very comfortably, very consciously, but from your heart. As if your heart has a nose or a mouth and you're inhaling and exhaling through your chest. Now remember, it's breath, rhythm, and movement. That's the formula, somatic relief for grief. Make your breath rhythmic and flow with ease. Good. Now start to expand that flow of the breath. Good. Inhaling to a count of 5, and then exhaling to a count of 5. Make your breath very slow. Let us engage to getting our breath to about 5 or 6 breaths per minute. Now know that the chaos of the mind is what makes grief so overwhelming. It's how we think about what we're feeling that makes grief with so much suffering. It's the mind trying to understand, asking why, and questions in ways in which it can't even grapple with. Grief itself is a paradox. That's why the heart can hold what the mind can't understand. It can hold the binaries. It can hold multiplicities. So it's in this heart-focused breathing that not only we start to reclaim the power of the heart, we start to manage the air element, vata, the air element that is erratic. Know that thoughts are like waves. And we want to regulate those waves through the regulation of your breath. Good. In this way, somatic relief or grief is not actually about letting go of grief, but actually giving us courage to face and embrace and then release grief. That's the other formula. Face, embrace, and release. Because when we have emotion phobia, we're in the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response. We need that fifth F to face it. That requires courage. And the heart knows all about courage. The heart is courageously happening all the time. Knowing well that grief is ever present, yet we still love knowing that we will have loss. That is a courageous act. So let us give space for the heart to breathe wisdom into you and let you start to uncover the portal of your inner wisdom, of your truth, and start to allow your grief to breathe. Good. Good. Let's take a nice deep breath now together. And exhale. Good. And breathe with me. We're going to inhale deeply through the nose. And now exhale, purse the lips, and exhale very slowly, very consciously through the lips. Good. Inhale through the nose. Hold it for just a moment. Good. Now purse the lips and exhale very slowly. Good. Let's do it again. Inhale. Hold. And exhale through the pursed lips. Make it very slow, very conscious. Good. One last time. And exhale. Good. Nice smooth inhale. And exhale. Smooth inhale. And exhale. Good. Beautiful work. Beautiful work. This vagal tone breathing we just did with the pursed lips is one of the most effective practices to quiet the mind, to relax the mind. And that is the biggest part of grief work in the initial stages, how to quiet the mind. Know that a rested body creates a quiet mind. So somatic relief for grief is about how to engage the body at a systematic and energetic level to shift patterns with breath, rhythm, and movement to quiet the mind, and then the heart. Love can flow, and then we do our grief work. Okay?
AmarAtma, thank you so much for your wisdom, for your generosity, for the tender care with which you've held us, right? So the freedom and generosity of conversation, the good thing about replays, as a host, it's always hard for me because I'm also a nerd. Like, I'm one of the teachers that knows that, like, being a good teacher is being a dope ass student as well. So, like, you're dropping all these bombs, and I'm just like, yo, presence, Reggie, presence. There's a replay and maybe a transcript, right? So,
Yeah.
thank you for giving me the opportunity to practice presence. So, instead of being in my notebook just to be in this conversation. Hopefully this has been of service to other folks. And for those of you that expressed your losses, thank you for sharing your losses, because one thing I want to say as a grief teacher is that even if you share something inelegantly, sharing inelegantly is an opening of the heart, right? So finding the right words, that may take a lifetime, but sharing inelegantly in the company of other people is a key to healing. So for those of you that shared with us, we thank you. We honor that, and blessing upon the memories that you offered us. AmarAtma, any closing thoughts you have before I take us home?
I tell you, Reggie, you are such a special soul, bro. Like, we haven't had an opportunity to really delve deep within each other, but I'm like, where have you been my whole life, bro? Like, you're so special. Thank you for holding such an amazing space and asking your questions and really facilitating this conversation. I don't think that the spirit and the energy could have been there without you holding it and what you're doing, and you're holding all of our conversations. So much gratitude to you and to the Kripalu team behind the scenes that are making this summit happen. And to everybody who's present, who's watching, whether on the live or on the recording, much love to you. What you're going through is by far one of the most challenging and most difficult things. Let us do it with love and kindness and gentleness and tenderness. Let us do it with compassion. And let's not try to push through any of this. Let us do it with so much love. And know that the divisions we create in amidst ourselves, a part of our grief, is in part creating the divisions we see in our world. If we can heal the divisions within our own self, the fragmentations, we're going to heal the divisions we feel. Inherently, doing grief work is one of the highest spiritual practices we can do, and one of the most socially just and socially kind things we can do. So know that you have great power in your grief story and in your grief work. Know that, and let's do this work together. Let's heal this world, folks. Let's do this.
Solidarity, my family, my brother in grief ministry. Blessing to all of you for being here, for your presence, for donors who made this possible. All love, always.